Mitchell. The question is that this bill now be read a second time. I give the call to the member for Perth.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I would really like to answer the questions raised by the member for Mitchell. You know, what is the connection between these two bills? Because between this bill and the government's outrageous proposal for its paid paternity leave, and there is a very, very clear nexus, and there's a very clear reason why we need to oppose this bill before us today in order to take a stand on the paid paternity leave. And it is because this bill is actually demonstrating the rank hypocrisy of the government on this matter, and how what we've got is a series of student politics-like stunts that have in fact been attempted to be woven into a coherent policy. It demonstrates, the bill that we have before us here today demonstrates very clearly that there is indeed no coherent, consistent policy. Now, the bill that we are dealing with today is a bill that would transfer the administration of the paid paternity leave system to the government sector, and on the basis that this is, you know, all the other payments of government, all the other payments that government do, family tax benefits, they're all paid for by the government. But you see, when the Prime Minister is questioned as to why it is that this bill, this paid paternity leave, the Liberal paid paternity leave scheme, is going to be such a generous scheme, that it is going to indeed allow women who are very, very wealthy to have an enhanced entitlement. Sorry? The women on the minimum wage will get the minimum wage. So the scheme rewards. The scheme is very unlike any other government payment. It is unlike any other government payment because the more you earn, the more you get, which is completely, of course, contrary to the general payment scheme. And the justification for this, the justification that the Prime Minister always gives us for this little pet project of his, is that this paid parental leave is a workplace entitlement. It is not a welfare entitlement, and that's why it should be paid at people's wages in the same way that sick pay or holiday pay is paid at people's wages. So he's creating this great. This is a very, very different thing from any other benefit. All those other benefits that were being alluded to by the member for Mitchell, according to the Prime Minister, this is completely different and has to be assessed on a different way. So, as it is a workplace entitlement, then clearly it makes sense for it to be an entitlement that is paid for by the employer, although quite clearly the employer has to be properly compensated and compensated in advance so that there are no cash flow problems that occur as a result of having to pay this entitlement. And indeed, this is not something that has just been invented by the Labor government, this notion that an entitlement like this should in fact be paid for, paid through the employer, but indeed this was the recommendation of the Productivity Commission. The Productivity Commission, in providing its analysis of paid maternity leave, said this: given the desire to link paid parental leave to work, which is clearly something the Prime Minister wants to do, where an employer has a reasonable tenure, where an employee has a reasonable tenure with an employer, the employer would act as the agent for the government and pay the statutory leave payment on its behalf. This is the arrangement used in the United Kingdom. They go on to say that structuring payments in this way would strengthen the link between the employer and the employee, which should increase retention rate for the business and lead to higher lifetime employment by the women. And they go on to recommend that there be prepayment of this money so that there isn't cash flow problems, and as I understand it, that is indeed what was duly implemented. So here we have the Productivity Commission saying that, you know, it is important to create this linkage between the employer and the employee that's on paid paternal leave. We've got the paternal leave. We have got the Prime Minister going into overdrive trying to justify what could only be, in the current climate, considered to be overly generous arrangements for a certain segment of the community, going into overdrive saying these are workplace entitlements. These are completely and utterly different from any of the other entitlements that are paid by government. Yet we had the member for Mitchell, and I think there was the member for Corangamite before that, coming in here and saying these benefits should be considered in the same light as every other social benefit that is paid out by the government, and indeed be paid out by the government. So it is really important for us to stand up in relation to this piece of legislation and say we're not going to support it because it absolutely underpins the hypocrisy of the Prime Minister in relation to this whole scheme. Now, Labor did, before the last election, commit to providing some relief for small businesses, and there was an acknowledgement that when you're dealing with very small businesses, 20 employees or less, they're unlikely to have HR staff, and therefore we were prepared to look at an exemption in relation to those small businesses, but not this general opt-out. Not this general opt-out in a scheme that has now been sold to the public as something completely different from all other welfare payments, and that has been used, as I say, to justify the excessive nature of this scheme. And look, I want to go on and talk about many of the things that the member for Hotham has raised, because as someone that has indeed had children and known what the difficulty is for young mothers in returning to the workforce, to highlight the complete implausibility even of the Prime Minister's stated intention on this overly generous paid parental leave. An overly generous paid parental leave that is quite clearly being funded in part from a tightening and a holding back on childcare payments. And I know from my own experience, and I know from dealing with the young women in my electorate who are wanting to return to work, the biggest problem is the availability of childcare. The availability of childcare, and second to that is the cost of childcare. But even the availability is a massive problem, certainly in Perth. Trying to find somewhere where you can find care, in particular decent quality care for children, particularly again those less than 2, is the greatest impediment for women totally returning to the workforce. Again, the Productivity Commission had some really interesting things to say about the proposal for full replacement wages, which is effectively what we're getting here. It says payment at a flat rate would mean that labour supply effects would be the greatest for the lower income and less skilled women, precisely those who are most responsive to wage subsidies and who are least likely to have privately negotiated paid paternity leave. Full replacement wages for highly educated, well-paid women would be very costly for the taxpayer, and given their high attachment to the labour force and the high level of private provision of paid parental leave, would have few incremental labour supply benefits. So any rational analysis of the government's scheme for something along for replacement wages as opposed to the payment at a flat rate tells you that this is not good value for money. That if your aim is indeed to try to get women back into the workforce, this indeed is not how you do it. They point out here that those women that are on higher incomes are indeed very likely to have a high level of attachment to the labour force, and that there will be few incremental benefits to labour supply by directing the replacement wages policy. But you contrast that, if we were putting, can you imagine if we were putting $5 billion a year into childcare? Can you imagine how that would revolutionise the participation of women with young children? I'd put it to you, even if we were adding $1 billion a year to childcare, that we would see a marked increment in the number of women that would be returning to work, and indeed the amount of hours that were spent by those women who have returned to work. So, everything that, common sense combined with one's knowledge of the challenges to young parents, particularly women, wanting to return to work after they've had a child, will tell you that the locus of the additional money should be being put into not providing more subsidy for wealthy women to return to stay at home, and who indeed in all likelihood will be returning to work because of the pay that they can, their pay levels, their education levels, what they can expect when they can return to work. Every common sense, every equitable bone, every economic bone in one's body should tell you that this vast investment, this vast increment of money that is going into this replacement wages policy of paid parental leave is going down the wrong path. And that this money, a very considerable proportion of this money, should be put into beefing up beefing up the availability of childcare. But of course, in this budget, we get the opposite. We get a significant scaling back of childcare benefits. We see the childcare benefit threshold frozen. We see the childcare rebate cap frozen. One of the appalling things is that we see the universal access to preschool, almost $500 million per year discounted. This is where we get kids going in and getting kindergarten, four-year-old program, and the Commonwealth assistance to that being cut. An absolutely retrograde step, not just for childcare and women's participation, but in terms of the outcomes that we are getting through introducing universal access to kindergarten. In terms of children's childhood, the performance at school has been used, and it has been huge. And this is really a cut not only to childcare, but it is a dreadful cut to our education standards. We see the JET scheme, the Jobs, Education and Training Childcare Fee Assistance cut back just at the same time that we have got the Prime Minister saying that he's going to cut back on family tax benefit B, because no one should be sitting at home at work once their child is 6 and expecting the taxpayers to support it. But then where are you going to put the child? I mean, we see out of childcare places have been cut. So if you're wanting to return to work and you've got a 6-year-old child, that 6-year-old child will be at school during the school holidays and after hours, you are going to require out-of-school care. And in fact, what do we see? We've seen $450 million cut out of the after-school care budget. So how can you be... all of these positions that have been embraced are completely and utterly contradictory. We say we're wanting to cut down on the age of entitlement. We want people that once their kids turn 6, that they should be going back into the workforce, but we're cutting the availability of childcare for that at the same time that we are embracing a replacement wage policy for paid parental leave that on any economic analysis is shown to have very, very few incremental labour supply benefits.